Today we welcome Xiao. This is a particular event because Xiao will join us next year because she will be a new principal investigator and open a new group called Human Learning Group. And so she will present herself, her work, what her plan for us for the next year. So please welcome Xiao.
Bon, bonjour tout le monde, merci pour être venu. Je m'excuse de parler l'anglais pour la conférence, sinon ça va prendre 2 fois plus long. So the topic, the title of the talk according to the poster is the future of interactive technologies. But really what I wanted to talk about is the future research group that I'm going to have here next year. And actually, more specifically, since I'll be starting a new group, I'm looking to recruit new students. And so if you or anyone you know are interested in any of the topics that I'll be talking about, please come talk to me afterwards. I'd love to find ways to collaborate. Now, so the group is called the Human Learning Group, and we're interested in building new interactive technologies to help people, not just machines, but help people learn different topics across disciplines. Now, looking at this description that's now on the website, maybe you're wondering, but c'est quoi ça? À quoi ça sert? C'est que des mots-clés? And perhaps you're right, but in my talk today, I'd like to give you some examples of past projects that I have done and have been working on to make it a bit more concrete what these keywords are about. And I want to start off with a personal learning example. So here's an example of some sort of human learning. This is actually the story of my life. I was born in China, but I moved to the United States, more specifically to New Orleans when I was 8 years old. And afterwards, I went to MIT to do my studies, and not long ago, I moved to France. And actually, my life these days is all about Google Translate. Between English and French and Chinese, every time I need to write an email, I double check with Google Translate when I need to tell something to my parents in Chinese. So I'm sure you've all have used a lot of automatic translation devices, especially with machine learning. Recently, translation by machines has gotten super good. And you can even get to the point where if you're traveling to a different country, you take it out and maybe have a conversation with a cab driver in real time, which is quite magical. But there are some words that are quite difficult to translate, and these aren't just kind of obscure words special to a language like retrouvailles in French, which it takes you a whole paragraph to explain in English, but it could be something as fundamental as, for instance, to know, which in English is just to know, but in French you have savoir et connaître, which are very different. And if we go into Chinese, there's like half a dozen different words, all with different meanings, and you would use them very differently. So we see that when we start looking into the human dimension, there are things about the way that knowledge is represented that goes a bit beyond what computers currently are able to do. And so one of the reasons for studying human learning is to get a deeper understanding of these dimensions, both to help humans, but also to design better computational tools to make computers smarter. Now, another aspect of language which is quite interesting and which computers have not mastered across cultures is the melody and the rhythm of speech. So every language has its own song, we can say, and this is most notable for my first language, Chinese, where you have tones. So if I say ma or ma, they mean completely different things. But even between French and English, the intonation patterns are very different, where if I were to speak English like it was a French rhythm, you can hear the rhythm is very different. Sorry, I don't mean to be making fun of you. And if you, but when I speak French, there's still a bit of an accent. And intonation is something that's studied within the speech sciences, and it plays really important roles not only in determining the lexical meaning of words like in tonal languages, but also the expression of affect, emotions, kind of stress in sentences, but even something as simple as in France, for instance, when people talk, there's much less time in between phrases for people to jump in. And so learning even to participate in the rhythm of a conversation is something that's quite complicated to do when you're going across cultures. So intonation, even though it's a very universal part of speech and it's one of the most telling things, telling aspects of an accent, it's really difficult for people who aren't native speakers to learn. Now, why is it difficult? We can say that, okay, some people are just good at languages, some people aren't. But if we dig a little bit deeper, we can think about, so there's one part which is about listening, about perceiving different patterns with your ears and trying to organize them in different categories. Another part is having the habituation in your vocal apparatus, where if you're used to certain patterns, even if you know what's correct and what's not correct, you just have trouble making what you're supposed to, making the shapes that you're supposed to be making. And finally, in pronunciation training, there's a big focus on the differences in individual sounds, but in how the sounds are put together, there's not really such good ways of teaching and learning it. And so currently, I've been working with a lab that's been working on a vocal synthesizer that you control with your hand gestures. So this was originally developed as a new musical instrument. So this is a project from our collaborators at Jussieu, and I'm still currently collaborating with them. And it's you have a vocal synthesizer, and you can control it with your handwriting gestures. So getting back to the problems of learning intonation, oh yeah, and this chironomy is, chiro comes from the Greek of with the hand, and so chironomy is a term that talks about using your hands to pronounce things. So using your hand gestures and using such an interface correlates the auditory dimension with the kinesthetic dimension, as well as any visual guides that you can overlay onto the interface, so it can help people hear new sounds better. Using handwriting gestures is a kind of a clever way to bypass the problems that people might have with controlling their voice, because generally people have a lot more dexterity with their hands from everybody learning how to write. And also it's a way of externalizing the movements where your vocal cords are quite hidden, so it's hard to explicitly control them unless you've had a lot of training. And finally, using the vocal synthesizer enables people to focus just on the melodic level and not on the specific syllables which are pronounced by the artificial voice. And I also think that there is something about controlling a voice that's outside of yourself that takes the pressure off, because oftentimes people might be self-conscious about their own voices. And so this is a way to take it out in a different context and maybe make things more fun. So these are the premises of the Geppetto project, which I'm currently working on, but I would like to collaborate in the future for taking the project even further. So right now I'll talk about the work during my postdoc, which I have been working on for the past couple of years, and also at the end give a few ideas of directions that I think that this could go in. But most importantly, if any of this is interesting to you, and if you have any ideas for something connected to this that you might like to work on, please by all means come talk to me afterwards. So the vision behind this project is envisioning a sort of app for a mobile interface. So right now we have things like Duolingo that's very good at helping people practice grammar and little phrases, but I'm imagining something that helps people specifically work on pronunciation of different languages by tracing things on a mobile interface. Now, we're not quite there yet technologically, because right now the vocal synthesizer that I'm working with lives on my computer. And so for my research, I've had to kind of hack together a sort of server client structure where there's a mobile app that runs in the browser, and any device that opens that browser can talk to the computer that's controlling the vocal synthesis. Now, just a little explanation of the interface so far, which can still be improved a lot. So there's an area that allows you to move your hands or finger across it. And by moving your finger in the Y direction, it changes the pitch of the output sound. And the X direction is broken up into the different syllables. So touching a region for one syllable will output that syllable. And the speed of movement determines the timing of your output sound. So here is what it looks like.
Jean lève son verre. Jean lève son verre. Jean lève son verre. Jean lève son verre.
So in the beginning, there's an opportunity for the person to listen to a reference sound that they're trying to imitate. And then as they're moving their fingers across the screen, they're pronouncing that sound. And there's two different modes, one in which you can just experiment and it fades away, and another mode in which you can keep the trace that's there, listen to it afterwards, compare it to the reference, etc. So using this interface, the primary goal of my postdoc research is just to have some statistical validation that such a method of practice is able to enable non-native speakers to pronounce the intonation of different languages with pretty good accuracy. And we're looking also at observing how people use it so that we can improve the interface in the future. And we're asking some questions, scientific questions about comparing the chironomic or gestural modality with the vocal modality, looking at the effect of a visual guide, how it could help people, at whether timing is a difficult thing and how to design solutions for that. And as a baseline, we're always comparing the production of non-natives with native speakers. So I did a pilot study on French, where the video was from. I'm currently doing a study on English, and I'll be finishing up with a study on Chinese before I start here in Human Learning Group. So just to tell you a bit about the experiments that I'm working on right now, so we're using what's called a prosodic disambiguation paradigm, where we're picking a corpus of phrases to use in the experiment where they share the same sequence of syllables, but based on the melody of how you pronounce them, they mean different things. So for instance, like Jean lève son verre or Jean lève son verre. So it's oftentimes quite difficult for non-native speakers to make these subtle distinctions. And subjects. Oh yeah, so this experiment was done during the pandemic in February, so we didn't have that much choice of subjects, but we did manage to have people come in person, and nobody got COVID. So there were 5 non-native speakers who are all taking a course on French pronunciation at my university, and 5 native speakers who tried the interface. And during the So during the experiment, they first read each phrase just to see how they would normally pronounce the phrase. And then they had the gestural part where they made the gesture to pronounce the phrase, first without and then with the visual guide. And finally, they used their own voices to imitate a reference recording. And in terms of evaluation, for this particular experiment, we used 2 ways to compare the productions that the subjects made with the reference production, and we gave the subjects' production scores. And we put those into statistical models. And just to summarize the result, basically we found that the gestural condition performed quite comparably to the vocal condition. So there was no significant difference for correlation, which measures the overall similarity. There was about 1 semitone of significant difference for root mean square error, which measures like the actual difference between the sounds. But 1 semitone is a very, very small amount. When you're speaking, it's not something that would be noticeable. So we can safely say that the gestural condition performs just as well as vocal imitation, but it has some additional advantages of allowing for you to have a visual guide and allowing you to have more explicit control. Now, in terms of having a visual guide versus not having a visual guide, having a guide performed significantly better than non-guided. But we noticed that controlling timing was a bit difficult. So this is kind of a place where we have some opportunity to redesign the interface to have some easier ways of controlling the rhythm. And finally, during this experiment, we didn't find any significant difference between native and non-native speakers, which was somewhat surprising because in the way that they speak, there is a difference. So one interpretation of this is like the interface is kind of an equalizing thing where it enables non-native speakers to perform just as well as native speakers, which is encouraging. But I think it was probably because the non-native speakers, for this study that we had were already quite advanced. And so they didn't really have that much room for improvement, which is why for the following study that I'm working on right now, we wanted to pick a subject, a topic where subjects have more difficulty. And so this leads us into the English study, where, so in English, even though it's not a tonal language, according to the British School of Intonation Analysis, we say that English does have tones, tones being changes in frequency. So for instance, I can say hello, it goes up, or hello, and it goes down, or hello, which is what's called the rise fall. And those kind of all have different emotional meanings, and you can really get into the subtleties of interpreting what people mean by paying attention to this dimension. But one tone in English that's particularly hard for French speakers is what's called the fall-rise tone. So to give you an example of that, okay, well, so we have this phrase. I'll play you two different interpretations of it.
The inbox wasn't full.
So was the inbox full? Raise your hand if you thought the inbox was full. Raise your hand if you think it was empty. Okay, yeah. So it's empty. So now for the second one.
The inbox wasn't full.
So was the inbox full? Full. Not full. Okay, so it turns out if the second pronunciation where the intonation curve looks like a V, it's called the fall-rise tone. And when you say the inbox wasn't full, it actually means the opposite of the literal words. And I think actually the English intonation is probably the reason why English people and French people didn't get along historically. Because, one person would say something, they'll be like, oh, you look great. And maybe, imagining like a historic person being like, oh, thank you, but then it's actually the opposite. So for this study, we picked a whole corpus of phrases like this. So you have Susan didn't get 1 credit, she didn't get any credits, versus Susan didn't get 1 credit, which means she got lots of credits. Or Ken didn't feed the cat. He didn't feed the cat, but when you say it like Ken didn't feed the cat, it meant that he fed something, but not the cat, maybe the dog. And so to illustrate the possible meanings, I made these little drawings, and we had a bigger, so to get to these phrases, we actually had a lot more phrases, and we put them all into a perception test with native speakers just to make sure that they are perceived as they're intended to. And these were the ones that the native speakers all got more than 70% correct, which is actually quite interesting that it's not 100%, which says that even for English people, sometimes it's confusing to not say what you actually mean. So during the experiment, we had 3 parts where first people read each phrase and they saw the picture and the hint that suggested what they were supposed to be expressing. And then in the second part, they listened to a reference and they had to imitate exactly the intonation of the reference. And finally, there was the gestural part where it was always with the visual guide, because we demonstrated that in the last experiment, without the visual guide was just too hard, basically. So for the subjects, we ran 24 subjects total, 12 of each type. And I actually went to London for part of the British study. And for the data, so instead of comparing the data with the reference recording, we are doing something, or I'm doing something a bit, I'm doing some statistical modeling on the curves themselves, but we're focusing just on the tone carrying part of the curve. So as you can see in this representation, in the beginning, there's like some little waves, and then at the end, there's the big wave. And so we segmented just the part with the big shape and kept those for analysis. And I don't yet have the statistical results yet because I'm doing the analysis right now, but I can show you some graphs of, so these are all native French speakers, and this is their curves for one phrase, for the region of interest for one phrase. So for reading, I have some samples also to show. So here's what it sounds like. Okay.
Susan didn't get one credit.
Okay, so what I'm showing here is they're supposed to say Susan didn't get one credit, which is the one credit, the one that goes up at the end. But as you can see in these curves, most people were not able to make the right shape when they were just reading the phrase. But then for the vocal imitation, we see that some people were quite good at listening and replicating that. But because this is kind of a hard shape to make, not everybody was able to get the right shape. And here's an example of somebody who
Susan didn't get one credit.
So it sounds better than what he did for reading, but it still may not always be interpreted the way that he intended. But finally, for the gestural condition, you can see already from the charts that everybody was able to follow the guide. So this is what it sounds like. So as you can see, in the beginning of the phrase, it's a bit like Susan didn't, it sounds like he's drunk because the timing is a bit difficult to control. However, in the part that actually counts, the one that where he's like one credit, this person was able to make a really good shape. So that's for the English study. For the Chinese study, what's really quite interesting, so here are the frequency curves for the Chinese tones, and the one that's the most difficult is the tone 3, and that's actually quite similar in shape to the fall rise tone that's difficult in English. So I'm planning to do a study before the end of my postdoc on Chinese, and just to give you an example of what Chinese sounds like with vocal synthesis.
不知晓处处闻啼鸟
So this is some famous Chinese poetry that I'm pronouncing with this instrument called the theremin, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a couple of seconds. But just in terms of how it relates to human learning group. So during my postdoc, I demonstrated and will finish demonstrating as I finish the postdoc that using gestures is a viable way for non-native speakers to practice pronunciation, and it could even be a way for them to go beyond the limitations of their natural voice. Now, for future work, what I would like to work on here is actually the fun part, because I did the boring stuff to kind of validate, like, okay, you can actually do this. But now we can imagine designing improvements to the interface, trying out different interfaces, maybe designing games that can, gamify the study. You can imagine, I don't know, like tracing birds or something, or collecting animals, like Pokemon, but for intonation. Or on the other hand, it also allows us to design longer term experiments. And I've already spoken to my current collaborators who are working both on the vocal synthesis and the current place where I'm doing the postdoc, which is more on the didactic pedagogy side. And so there'll be a lot more opportunities to extend this work if you're interested in collaborating. So the second thing I want to talk about is the theremin. So it's the weird instrument that you saw in the video that I showed with the Chinese. And does anybody already know what the theremin is? Okay, that's pretty good. Yeah, okay. So for those of you who don't know, the theremin is an electronic musical instrument, and it was invented in 1920 by Lev Theremin, who was a Russian physicist, and it's special for being one of the world's first electronic musical instruments, and for being played without any sort of physical touch. So there's videos of, and if you haven't seen the theremin, so this was Clara Rockmore, who is a famous theremin virtuosa performing the theremin, and it's quite a special instrument because it's very, very sensitive and it's very, very expressive, but it's also known for being very hard to play. And as I mentioned, or as I was showing in this previous slide, I actually started teaching myself to play the theremin starting from 2017 as an experiment in learning, because I wanted to apply what I already knew about learning piano and learning other subjects to see if I can tackle this difficult topic. But it has also become a sort of playground for me to experiment both with electronics and with music. And so with DVIC, actually, I did a collaboration with Gershon where we were jamming together, and I was playing the theremin as he was driving through Wandering Mind, which was quite fun. So the theremin, as you can see in this video, it plays, it sounds expressive, but the natural theremin doesn't know how, or doesn't speak with words. And this is, oh gosh, I started it too early. And so when I was working with the lab at Jussieu called LEM on their vocosynthesis projects, one of the things that we did was to connect my theremin to the vocosynthesizer in order to be able to sing with lyrics. And this is what it sounds like.
Quand il me prend dans ses bras, il me parle tout bas, je vois la vie en rose.
Yeah, well, so you can see my mouth is not moving. It's not me singing because my French is not that good. So you might be wondering how it works. So the way that it works is we first have to prepare an audio sample, which is a monotone of the words to be played. So here is an example. This is me doing the sample for the Chinese, which I showed earlier. And then there's a part where you have to label where the syllables are. We're starting to automate that a bit, but it's still kind of a manual process right now. And finally, there's a max patch that, that it's the software behind the system. And in order to control the syllables, there we go. There is a sensor that I'm holding in my left hand. So basic primer on the theremin, there are two antennas. This one controls the volume, and this one controls the pitch. So those things you can map pretty straightforwardly to the vocosynthesizer. And then you have the sample already, which is a sequence of consonants and vowels. And basically, this force-sensitive resistor that I have in my hand is a binary switch, where when it's open, it maps to vowels, and when it's closed, it maps to clusters of consonants. So you're kind of like being a sock puppet. So you can see in here, it's there's the one of them is the frequencies for Je vois la vie en rose. One is the volume curve, and then here is the openness, closedness of the sensor. So this was just a little side project that I did for fun, but I think that there's actually some more opportunities to explore this work if you're interested. So on the one hand, there's improvements to the hardware. So I'm not really a super hardware person, and the FSR thing that was hacked together could really be a lot better. And I think maybe some of you are more wizards in hardware and might have ideas. And I think there could be other sensors that you can add to the hands to change other elements of the voice, because what I showed here is a pretty simplified model of the voice being just volume, frequency, and syllable sequence, but there's other things of color that you can imagine by doing, I don't know, different tilts or other sorts of sensors on the hand. And finally, I think that there's really interesting questions to think about between the connection between the hands and the voice in terms of controlling the muscles for singing. So in some ways, it's related to the work on speech and learning intonation, but it's looking at it from a more artistic perspective. And so it's a lot of the questions are the same, but the end goal is somewhat different. And so it enables you to get a deeper understanding of these questions. So the last project or projects I want to talk about is my PhD thesis from the MIT Media Lab. So I am very interested in music, as you can see, and my projects from the Media Lab were using a piano. And actually, when I was there, I had this office, and I managed to get a grand piano into the office. And so I worked between the piano keyboard and the computer keyboard, and I would code by day and play piano by night, which was quite a charmed existence. And here are the projects that I worked on. So there's Mirror Fugue. Oh gosh. It's gonna play. Which is having a reflection that plays the piano. And then the other project is little animated characters. On the one hand, these projects are artistic projects. They could be art installations. But on the other hand, they're also vehicles to explore questions about user interface design and questions about learning. And so specifically in my thesis, I was interested in interfaces that evoke a close coupling between the body and the sound for music, because I think for many of us in the present world, music has become such a disembodied thing, but I think there's a lot of richness and a lot of I guess importance in understanding the link between sound and the body. And another question is about how to design interactive systems to support music learning that's beyond just playing the notes. And just in general, I was interested in exploring strategies for higher level learning across different domains. And in this work, I was really inspired by the work of Seymour Papert with Logo. So Seymour Papert was a computer scientist and educator who was at the Media Lab, who pioneered a programming language called Logo for children. And the way it works is you control what's called a turtle on the screen by giving it commands. And there was both a turtle in the computer and also a turtle in real life. And one of the things that Seymour Papert and his colleagues like Cynthia Solomon encouraged the children to do is to imagine themselves in place of the turtle as they program the turtle. And so this is really fascinating and really inspiring for me, because we're talking about programming the computer, which is often seen as this very logical, intellectual task. But in the way that they're teaching these children, they invoke the body, and they invoke kind of an embodied understanding of being in the world. So now I was trying to apply these ideas to learning music on the piano, partly because, well, the piano is such a widely played instrument and it's super versatile, but mostly because I played the piano myself when growing up and I was traumatized by it. Because the way that you typically learn how to play classical music on the piano is this really, disciplined process of having to learn to read the notes from the score, and then to programming your body to play the notes by a lot of boring repetition. And oftentimes, at least in America, a lot of people quit after not so long. And there are some technologists who try to make the process a bit easier by designing interactive systems, but a lot of these systems generally take for granted the process of learning as programming your body to play the correct notes, and they don't really think about other dimensions of music as it relates to the body, as it relates to the harmonic structures, as it relates to emotion, communication, imagination. And these were the things that I wanted to explore more in my projects. So in terms of technology, I was very much inspired by the works of augmented reality and tangible interfaces and also shape-changing interfaces. So I was in Hiroshi Ishii's tangible media group and was kind of surrounded by these sorts of projects where you would have everyday objects augmented, or you have something that changes shape, but there's also digital information projected on it. And before Hiroshi came to the Media Lab, he had been working on projects on collaboration, which was all about not only sharing information between two people in remote places, but also sharing traces of their hands or their facial expressions or even touch across distance. And so the first project that I showed, Mirror Fugue, started off as just an image that I had when I was practicing the piano, and I was looking at the surface in front of the keys, and I was like, wouldn't it be really lovely if you could play a duet with somebody else's reflection? And I actually applied to the Media Lab with this idea, and I drew some pretty pictures and managed to convince Hiroshi to accept me, except for I had no idea how to implement this. But then I made some prototypes, and the prototypes got better. And finally, I convinced Yamaha to give me a grand piano for my office. And actually, when the piano with its moving keys came, and I started projecting onto the keys, that was where something kind of magical happened, where when people sat in front of this, people often said that they felt like there was really somebody there, or that there was somebody beside them, or that even they themselves were playing the piano, even though some people didn't even know how to play. And so there is something that's psychologically quite powerful and quite interesting about if you give people the right stimuli, arranged spatially in the right ways, you can trick the brain into believing a lot of things. So at the point that we're able to have such an interface, we can imagine having a sort of, having a sort of remote concert somewhere and having it streamed onto your piano at home. When I was working on this, like almost 10 years ago, it was not really a possibility to actually do the remote part, but now with the technological advancements that we had during the pandemic, it actually becomes a real possibility to actually prototype some of these things. And so you can imagine playing along with them on your piano. And here is a performance that I did at TEDx Boston, where this was like a three-way communication. I mean, a little bit Wizard of Oz, but you can imagine having a performance where people from across the world get streamed in. And finally, here's a video from an exhibit that I did in New Orleans with a New Orleans pianist. And this woman actually doesn't play at all, but it was really interesting to observe her kind of mirror the way that her idol, John Cleary, played the piano. And oftentimes I show this to people who are musicians with the sound off, and they think that it's her who's playing with him, just because she's making the right gestures. And finally, one thing I really like to think about is playing a duet with yourself in the past. And so this is Hiroshi's daughter, but we're pretending that I'm her, like 20 years later, all grown up. And I think that there's something quite beautiful about being able to evoke ghosts of the past and interacting with them through the use of multimedia technology in a way that really makes you feel something and really gives you opportunities for reflection. So like imagining playing a duet with your grandparents when they're at your age, or even with yourself, from 20 years ago, and reflecting on how much you grew. So the second project is I wanted to talk about is Andante, which is having these little animated characters walk on the piano keys. So I guess maybe this is kind of my way of talking to myself in the past, where, you know, addressing all the frustrations that I had when I was a kid learning to play the piano and trying to imagine how things could be different. And in this, I was very much inspired by comics and cartoons, where oftentimes you have very abstract shapes and abstract movements, but when you have these sorts of abstract shapes, even though they're abstract, if they move in the right ways, then they actually carry a lot more life. And so as an example, we can imagine, so here's a piece that's played by these little walking guys. This is a canon by Bach, and you can imagine each voice of the canon as a different character. And a canon is kind of like the same melody, but it's offset in time. And so having it represented in this way is a way of better understanding the structure of the piece as well. Or we can imagine having a jam with the little character. So he's blue, he's playing the blues, he's doing a walking bass, and I'm kind of playing really bad blues with him, but we have Herbie Hancock who's playing better. So this project, I posted it online, and a piano teacher who was living in Boston at the time got in touch with me, Pablo Puntes, and he wanted to try out this technology with his actual students. And I spoke with him a lot about the process of learning and children, and we're talking a lot about, for instance, how children prefer more concrete modes of sense-making as opposed to abstract symbols, but how in traditional music learning, you start off with what's abstract, and then you have to find what's concrete in that, and how a lot of people have trouble. And we came up with a sort of framework for the way that he teaches his students, where you start off with something that's very concrete, where you listen, and then you try to internalize it by putting it into your own body, by clapping or speaking along with the music you're trying to learn. And only after you have a bodily understanding do you then take it to your instrument, but you're always going by what you hear and what you feel. And then only after that do you learn how to analyze the piece, and maybe afterwards you can even improvise. And we're thinking about how my system, Andante, can be integrated as part of this process. And so we prototyped the system where we still have the score, but we have an interface that kind of highlights the different parts of the score and have the little figures play the piece onto the piano as a way of having the kids, I guess, learn in this extend stage. And here are some videos from some lessons. And what's quite interesting here is I really like how she put her hand onto the keys, and to not just hear and see, but also feel how it would go. We can also imagine using the Andante system to help with the analytical part of the piece, where it's not just about learning notes, but also learning harmonic structure, which is something that's never taught to kids. But we can represent it in a more concrete vocabulary using houses, for instance, for different harmonies. And so then we did a couple of studies where we compared showing only the score versus having the figures, and then another one where we compared two interactive representations. One is the traditional like falling blocks, and one with the figures. And I just want to show a few videos of interactions with kids. So first of all, everybody really loved it because I think there's something playful and imaginative with the little characters, as opposed to this is like the traditional way of learning where the little girl is like really stressed out and she's trying to parse the score. Okay. Now, with the falling blocks, the kids had a pretty easy time getting used to it, and they enjoyed it. But if you look at how they play with it, where they tend to focus on each individual note. It's almost like they're copying not just the notes, but also the discreteness of how the blocks are falling, compared to the same thing using the little animated guy. Where I think in this case, it's like even though he's just learning that part of the piece, already you see more understanding of the musical structure and the musical shape. So, in terms of what it means for human learning group, now maybe I can convince Yamaha to give me a piano, and then we can have a piano somewhere and have jam sessions. But before that happens, I think I would still be very interested in collaborating on projects that are related to music learning and also other sorts of movement learning. So I hope that now it's more clear what I mean by this description of the human learning group, and what you're thinking is more like this and not the other thoughts. And if you have ideas, please get in touch. Please talk to me afterwards. And before I end, I actually just have a couple of more things. So at the Media Lab, maybe I'm sure Clément has talked and Mark have talked about this a lot. We have these sayings: publish or die, demo or die. Publish or perish, demo or die, deploy or die. And the projects that I have shown you in the earlier parts of the presentation, I'm quite aware everything has been in an academic setting. So I wanted to show another project that is in the real world that kind of captures a lot of the themes that I'm interested in related to learning. So this is an art installation that I worked on in New Orleans. It's in this building. There's a maker space in the building. There's some shared workspace. But basically, the client approached me because there is a stairwell with a big elevator in the center of it. And they had to take the elevator out for safety reasons, but there's just this giant 4-story prison that remains, and she's like, do something cool with it. So I did a bunch of sketches, and afterwards, the idea that I settled upon was having different metaphors of the mind depicted by each floor in the elevator cage. And I chose this idea because the building is an education center, and there's a makerspace. There's like education-related startups, and I wanted to kind of inspire people to think about the mind. And so the idea is that each level picks a different way of thinking about the mind from throughout history. So there's Le Volière de Platon in the first floor, where ideas are birds and they're flying around. The second level is a library or invisible cities of the mind. The third level is mind is a machine, and the fourth level is a connectionist version of thinking about neurons and neural networks. And each level also relates to the iconography of New Orleans in some way and uses tools from the makerspace to build. So I'll just show you a video of what it looks like. Is it? There's some interactivity. When you touch the golden balls, you charge up the birds and they fly up. And these are all houses in the traditional New Orleans style that were made on a laser cutter. amazing members of the team. This floor was a collaboration with a local artist in New Orleans who specializes in making machines. And actually the piano is from my piano at the Media Lab because there was a freak accident where a pipe burst in my ceiling and it flooded the piano, which meant that I didn't return it to Yamaha and I just kept it for this art project that came later. And finally, the birds leave the cage. There's a mural of the Mississippi River and neurons coming out from it. And this is what it looks like in its totality. Yeah, well, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Xiao. It's going to be a great moment. I want to say it's in addition to be a future instant, it's the instant of poetry, because you have a lot of poetry, science, human learning, neuroscience, a lot of projects. So thank you very much again for sharing your background and your vision for your new group.
Yeah.